No hyperspace lane carried it. No sensor array on Coruscant registered its arrival. The tear opened silently above the Ecumenopolis's endless spires, a wound in the fabric of the galaxy itself. And something fell through it. Not a ship, not a probe, but a man, trailing sparks of a light that belonged to no star in this sky. Third person, and the galaxy far, far away had never seen anything like what was about to hit its lowest levels. The Clone Wars had been raging for the better part of 2 years now, a fire that had consumed 1,000 systems and showed no signs of guttering out. On the surface levels of Coruscant, senators debated appropriations, while news feeds looped footage of Republic victories on worlds most citizens couldn't find on a star chart. But beneath all of that gleaming bureaucracy and diplomatic theater, in the layered dark of the planet's undercity, none of it mattered. Down here, in the levels where sunlight was a rumor, and the Jedi Temple was just another distant light in a sky you never saw, survival was the only ideology anyone bothered with. It was into this world, level 1313, a warren of smuggler dens, black market cantinas, and forgotten maintenance shafts where 3 separate criminal syndicates maintained an uneasy truce. That the tear in reality deposited its cargo, a hard impact against a durasteel catwalk, a crumpling groan of metal, and then silence, broken only by the distant hum of speeder traffic 100 levels up and the drip of condensation from a coolant pipe that hadn't been serviced since the Republic was young. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The figure that lay broken on that catwalk did not, by any reasonable measure, look like he should still be breathing. His clothes, flannel shredded to ribbons, a leather jacket scorched, along one shoulder, were soaked through with blood that hadn't finished flowing yet. His right side had taken the worst of it. 3 long gashes that should have opened him to the bone. A fracture in his skull that any medical droid on this planet would have called fatal. And yet, even as the first curious eyes turned toward the crash site, something in his flesh was already knitting itself back together. The torn muscle fibers stitching closed with a faint, wet sound that made the nearest onlooker a Rodian fence named Trep, who'd seen more death in this alley than most beings saw in a lifetime, take an involuntary step back. Logan. He didn't know the name of this place yet. He didn't know the year, the war, or the 6 different factions currently vying to control the war's outcome. What he knew, in the disoriented half-second before his healing factor finished, dragging him back to full consciousness, was pain. The specific, familiar pain of a body being rebuilt from the inside. A sensation he'd endured so many thousands of times across so many decades that it barely registered as remarkable anymore. What was remarkable was the smell. Ozone and machine oil, and something else underneath it. Something electric and vast that reminded him, in some primal animal part of his brain, of standing too close to a live wire. This place had a charge to it. A current running under everything. The way certain forests back home had a stillness that wasn't really stillness at all. His claws were the first thing to move, 3 adamantium blades sliding free from each hand with a sound like a rifle bolt snapping home. Muscle memory kicking in before conscious thought caught up. He came up into a crouch on the catwalk, blood dripping from wounds that were already closing. Yellow eyes, feral, alert, doing the fast inventory of exits and threats that had kept him alive since before some of these buildings had been built. Sweeping the scene, he'd been in the middle of something. A fight in an alley off 9th Avenue. Half a dozen hand agents with more guns than sense, and then light. A tear in the world that smelled wrong and sounded like a scream made of static. He'd gone through it clawing, still swinging at an enemy that was no longer there. And now he was standing, barely, in a place with 3 moons visible through gaps in an endless skyline of towers. Air thick with 1,000 species worth of smells. And gravity that felt almost right, but not quite. Trep the Rodian fence had, over a long and morally flexible career, learned exactly one lesson that mattered. Don't stick around to find out what the bleeding man with knives for hands wants. He was already backing toward the nearest access tunnel. Subvocal comm already keyed to whichever buyer might pay best for information about an off-worlder who'd just fallen out of the sky, already healing from wounds that should have killed him twice over. Logan didn't chase him. Not yet. He straightened slowly, testing the give of ribs that had been broken and were now merely bruised, rolling a shoulder that popped back into its socket with a wet click. Whatever had just happened to him, and he had exactly zero working theories, having burned through most of his patience for the impossible sometime. Around the third time he died and come back. One thing was clear immediately. This wasn't home. Home didn't have skies like corrugated durasteel stretching to every horizon. Home didn't have that low electric hum under the air itself. Like the whole world was one enormous machine breathing in and out. He retracted his claws with a soft snick, flexed his hands, and started walking. Whatever this place was, whatever war was clearly being fought in the smoke-stained battle-scarred walls around him, he intended to find out exactly what he was dealing with before it found out what he could do to it. The Undercity of Coruscant did not welcome strangers, and it certainly did not welcome strangers who bled like normal beings and healed like something out of a Sith holocron. Within 20 minutes of Logan's arrival on level 1313, word had already begun to ripple outward through the district's tangled network of informants, black market brokers, and low-level muscle, the peculiar, valuable kind of word that traveled fast precisely because everyone who heard it understood its worth. An off-worlder, armed with something that came out of his hands instead of a holster, wounds closing in real time. In a galaxy where Bacta, tanks, and cybernetic replacement limbs were the best medicine could offer, even the wealthiest senator, a being who simply didn't stay hurt, was not a curiosity. He was a commodity. Logan felt the shift in the air before he understood its cause. He'd spent decades, centuries, if he let himself count that far back, which he generally didn't, learning to read a room, a street, a war zone, and this level of Coruscant's Undercity was, in its bones, no different than 100 back-alley markets he'd walked through in 100 forgotten cities. Except everything here was wrong in the specifics. The beings weren't human, not most of them, insectoid eyes tracking him from a doorway, a Twi'lek Leku twitching with poorly concealed interest as he passed, a hulking Gamorrean, who eyed him with the flat calculation of a professional appraiser. The technology was wrong too, in ways he couldn't yet name. Screens that hung in the air without visible projectors. Weapons carried openly that hummed with a barely audible whine he'd never heard from a firearm. And underneath all of it, that current, that electric hum in the air itself, stronger in some places than others, like walking past a transformer station that stretched invisibly across an entire world. He didn't have a name for it yet. He would. The first real trouble found him 3 blocks from the crash site, in the sub-level entrance to a cantina, lit in shades of blue and violet that spilled across wet duracrete. For beings blocked the narrow passage, professional, from the way they held themselves, weapons drawn but not yet raised, the posture of people who'd done this exact routine 100 times and expected it to go the same way it always did. Their leader was human, or human enough, a scarred woman with a shock of white hair and a blaster rifle held loose and easy across her chest. Black Sun, though Logan had no way of knowing that yet. Enforcers for one of the Undercity's oldest criminal syndicates, sent to collect on the rumor, already spreading like wildfire through the level's information brokers. Word's already out about you. Stranger, the woman said, her basic accented in a way that told him nothing except that translation was, apparently, not going to be a problem here. One small mercy in an evening otherwise devoid of them. Boss wants a look at whatever's making you tick. Come easy, we don't have to hurt each other. Logan looked at the 4 of them, the way they'd fanned out to cover angles, the confidence in their stances, the particular quality of violence they were clearly used to being on the giving end of, and felt something in his chest that was almost like relief. This, at least, was a language he spoke fluently. Funny thing to say, he said, voice a low rasp, to a guy who just got done getting hurt a lot worse than anything you're planning. The claws came out with that same snick, catching the cantina's neon glow along 6 inches of gleaming adamantium. And for just a moment, all 4 of them hesitated, the universal reaction of professionals encountering a variable their training hadn't accounted for. It cost them the fight before it started. Logan closed the distance in a single motion, inside the woman's rifle before she could bring it fully to bear. Claws opening 3 parallel lines across the barrel that sheared it in half with a shower of sparks and superheated metal. He didn't kill her. Some old, worn-down code in him still drew that line reflexively. Even here, even now, even against people who very clearly would have shown him no such courtesy. But the pommel strike that followed put her down hard enough that she wouldn't be getting up before he was long gone. The other three lasted marginally longer, which was to say, not very long at all. A bolt of blaster fire caught him high in the shoulder, cauterizing as it went, and he felt the familiar, violent tug of his body already, working to push the metal fragment back out and knit the wound shut even as he drove a knee into the ribs of the being who'd fired it. By the time it was over, perhaps 40 seconds, start to finish, 3 of the 4 enforcers were unconscious or worse, and the 4th was sprinting back into the dark with the particular speed of someone who'd just seen something that violated everything he thought he understood about how fights were supposed to go. Logan stood in the drifting smoke and neon, breathing hard, the shoulder wound already closed to an angry pink scar that would be gone entirely within the hour. He looked down at the woman he'd left breathing on the Duracrete, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite satisfaction, the tired, familiar arithmetic of a man who'd done this exact math too many times to count and never quite landed on an answer he liked. "Shoulda just left me alone," he muttered to no one and started walking again. He didn't know it yet, but the 4th enforcer's frantic report relayed up through 3 layers of black sun hierarchy within the hour would eventually reach ears far more dangerous than any street lieutenants. And in the gleaming spires, above the Undercity's endless dark, an entirely different kind of attention had already begun to turn toward the anomalous energy signature that Coruscant's deep sensor arrays had just flagged, buried in the noise of the planet's teeming population. A spike of something that didn't match any known species' force signature and didn't match anything at all. Word moved fast in the Undercity, but it moved faster once credits got involved. And by the time the sun cycle lights embedded in the ceiling struts above level 1313 had shifted from their dim daytime setting to the deeper blue that passed for evening this far from any actual sky, the story of the off-worlder with blades in his hands had already been sold, resold, and embellished across 3 separate information brokers. By the time it reached safe, something, a Deveronian who ran a modest but ambitious slice of Black Sun's territory across 4 sublevels, the story had grown a healing factor that regenerated lost limbs, claws that could cut through durasteel like flimsy, and a body count that hadn't actually happened yet. Save didn't believe half of it. He didn't need to. Even a tenth of that story, if true, was worth more than every other rumor currently circulating on his level combined. Find him. Save told the enforcer who'd limped back with the survivors of the Cantina ambush. Find him, and don't be stupid about it this time. I want to know what he is before anyone else does. The problem, one that would become a recurring theme in Coruscant's relationship with its newest and most unwilling resident, was that Logan had absolutely no interest in being found by anyone with an agenda. He'd spent the hours since the ambush doing what he did best in unfamiliar territory, moving, watching, learning. He'd found a maintenance corridor to hole up in, torn strips from a discarded tarp to bandage wounds that had, admittedly, mostly already closed on their own, and spent a long, quiet stretch simply listening to the sounds of a planet-spanning city breathing. Around him, the hum of traffic in levels far above, the drip and clank of ancient infrastructure, snatches of a dozen languages drifting through ventilation shafts, none of which he understood, all of which told him something about the scale of the thing he'd landed in. He was, by nature and by decades of hard-won experience, not a man who scared easily, but standing in the dark beneath an entire world's worth of civilization, stacked in glittering towers overhead. He allowed himself a moment of something adjacent to unease. Whatever had torn him out of that alley off 9th Avenue hadn't dropped him in some backwater. This was big. This was the kind of place that had its own gravity, its own way of pulling everything toward it, including, he suspected, whatever attention his little display in that cantina had already generated. He wasn't wrong. 2 levels down and 40 minutes later, That suspicion proved itself correct in the form of 6 more of Save's enforcers. This batch, smarter than the last, spread wide, using the narrow maintenance corridor's blind corners. One of them carrying a device that pulsed with a soft red light. Logan didn't recognize, but instinctively distrusted. A tracker, he'd learn later. They'd found him through cruder means than he'd have liked to believe. Bribed informants who'd watched which tunnel he ducked into. Plus a stroke of bad luck involving a security camera he hadn't accounted for. Because why would he? This wasn't a world he knew the rules of yet. The fight that followed was uglier than the first. Precisely because these 6 had come prepared for what they'd been told to expect. Stun net launchers instead of straight blaster fire. An attempt to blanket the corridor in electrified mesh designed to drop a rancor. It caught him across the shoulders and dropped him to one knee. Current screaming through a body that had weathered worse from Magneto. On a bad day. But the delay cost the enforcers the only advantage they had. He tore through the net with his claws before the charge had finished cycling. Came up inside their formation. In the tight corridor where their numbers meant nothing. And did what he'd always done best in close quarters. Became something less like a fighter and more like a force of weather. 3 minutes of controlled violence that left 2 enforcers unconscious. 2 more fled. And one, the one carrying the tracker, staring up at him from the floor with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of someone whose entire understanding of how dangerous the galaxy could be had just been catastrophically revised. "Tell your boss," Logan said. Voice flat, claws still extended. "I ain't a prize to be collected. Next crew he sends, I stop being polite about it." He let the man run. It was, he reflected afterward, probably a mistake. Mercy usually was. In his experience, a debt that came due eventually, but some things about him hadn't changed no matter how many dimensions he crossed to get here. What he didn't know, couldn't know, with no frame of reference for how this world worked, was that the tracker's brief activation, combined with the earlier violent energy signature from the Cantina fight, had done considerably more than alert a mid-level crime boss. Deep within the Jedi Temple's spire, in a chamber devoted to monitoring disturbances in the Force across the capital, a meditation-focused crystal had registered a spike that defied easy categorization, not light, not dark, but something adjacent to both, violent and present and entirely unlike anything in the Order's considerable archives. A young Jedi Knight, still years from his own council seat, had frowned at the readout, exchanged a glance with the sensor technician beside him, and reached for a comlink. "I think," Obi-Wan Kenobi said quietly, "we need to have a look at this." The Jedi Council chamber sat at the pinnacle of the temple's highest spire, a circular room ringed with windows that offered an unobstructed view of Coruscant's endless skyline. A vantage point meant, in theory, to remind those who sat in judgment there of the vastness of what they served. Obi-Wan Kenobi had stood in that chamber more times than he could easily count, but rarely with a report quite this strange laid out before the assembled masters. "The signature registered twice," he explained, gesturing to the holographic readout hovering above the chamber's central projector, a jagged spike of light, against a field of steady baseline noise. Once in the undercity of level 1313, approximately 6 hours ago. A second, smaller spike an hour later, half a kilometer away. Both readings are unusual. Unusual how? Master Mace Windu's voice carried its characteristic weight. The question less curiosity than demand for precision. "They don't match any known Force-sensitive species signature in the archives," Obi-Wan said. "Not human, not Zabrak, not Twi'lek. There's a presence there. Something is generating that spike, but it doesn't resolve into anything I've encountered. It's not quite light. It isn't quite dark either. It's simply other." Around the chamber, the assembled masters exchanged the particular quality of silence that Obi-Wan had learned, over years of service, to recognize as genuine concern rather than mere procedural caution. In the middle of a galaxy-spanning war, with separatist incursions demanding attention on a dozen fronts in the Senates, patients wearing thinner by the week, an unexplained anomaly on their own, capital was not a distraction any of them could easily justify chasing, and yet the alternative, ignoring a Force signature that defied every category the Order possessed, carried its own considerable risk. "Sense a threat in this, do you?" Master Yoda's ears tilted. his gaze steady on Obi-Wan across the chamber's expanse. Obi-Wan considered the question with the care it deserved. I sense urgency. Whatever this being is, it fought twice. From what the local authorities' incident reports suggest, both times against organized criminal elements in the Undercity. Whether it's a threat to the Republic specifically, I couldn't say. But it's clearly capable of violence. And it's clearly attracting attention from exactly the sort of factions we'd prefer. Didn't get there first. That settled it, more or less. The Council's decision, reached with the particular efficiency of beings who'd spent 2 years learning to make hard calls quickly, was straightforward in its outline, if not its execution. Locate the source of the anomaly, assess the threat it posed, and if possible, extend the Order's hand before Black Sun, or worse. The Separatists' considerable intelligence network secured whatever this being represented for themselves. Obi-Wan, given his role in flagging the disturbance and his considerable experience navigating Coruscant's less savory levels, was the obvious choice to lead the search. He descended into the Undercity 3 hours later, trailed by a small squad of clone troopers from the 212th, and accompanied by Ahsoka Tano, whose own restless curiosity about the anomaly had earned her a place on the assignment, despite Anakin's grumbled reservations about his Padawan wandering into criminal territory without him. So what exactly are we looking for? Ahsoka asked, her Leku catching the shifting neon of the Undercity's endless commercial sprawl as they moved deeper into Level 1313's tangled infrastructure. Something I can't fully explain, Obi-Wan admitted, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it rather more literally than he usually allowed himself. To be with a Padawan not his own, a presence unlike anything in our records. Possibly dangerous, possibly not. We proceed with caution either way. The trail wasn't difficult to follow, in the end. Save the Devaronians' enforcers had left enough of a trail of broken equipment, unconscious subordinates, and terrified witnesses that even a moderately attentive investigator could have reconstructed Logan's path through the level over the preceding hours. What proved more difficult was the growing sense, as they moved deeper into the Undercity's shadowed warrens, that they were not the only ones searching. Twice, Obi-Wan caught the telltale flicker of black Sun scouts shadowing their own progress at a cautious distance, clearly hoping the Jedi would do the dangerous work of locating their quarry so the Syndicate could swoop in afterward. They found him, or rather, he found them, in the cavernous open space of an abandoned refueling depot 3 sublevels down, its cathedral-like emptiness lit only by the intermittent flare of a malfunctioning power coupling overhead. Logan had chosen the location deliberately. Good sight lines, multiple exits, high ground in the form of a catwalk running along the depot's upper reaches. He'd heard them coming from 200 meters out. The distinctive rhythm of armored boots on Duracrete. Unmistakably military, unmistakably organized in a way that Save's opportunistic thugs had never quite managed. He watched from the shadows of the catwalk as they entered. A bearded human in flowing robes. A young Togruta girl with twin lightsabers at her hip. And a squad of identical armored soldiers whose uniformity struck him as deeply, viscerally wrong, in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. Clones. An army of them, apparently, though he had no context yet for what that meant or why it should unsettle him as much as it did. "We know you're here," Obi-Wan called out, his voice carrying easily across the depot's open expanse, pitched with the calm, measured authority of a man accustomed to talking down far stranger things than an unidentified off-worlder. "We're not here to hurt you. We'd simply like to talk." From the shadows above, Logan's claws slid free with their familiar metallic rasp, catching the flickering light. "Yeah," he said, voice carrying down into the depot's cavernous dark. "Heard that one before." The claws didn't retract, but they didn't come swinging either, a hell breath of a standoff. Logan perched on the catwalk above while 3 lightsabers worth of potential violence waited below him, unlit, held in ready hands but not yet ignited. He'd learned enough in his years to recognize the particular tension of professionals, choosing restraint, and something about the posture of the bearded one, Obi-Wan, though Logan didn't have the name yet, read less like a predator and more like a man genuinely trying not to start something. He didn't have to. That didn't mean Logan trusted him. Trust wasn't a switch that flipped on because someone kept their weapon lowered. Trust was something earned across years. And this man had exactly 90 seconds of nonviolence to his name so far. "You've got a funny way of saying hello," Logan called down, staying where he was. Armed escort. Kid with 2 swords on her belt. That's a lot of firepower for a conversation. "A fair point," Obi-Wan replied, and, to his credit, Logan noted, didn't bother denying it. "Precautions, given the circumstances. You've been rather busy since your arrival. Several of Coruscant's less reputable citizens have found the experience memorable. They started it. I don't doubt it." Something in the man's tone carried genuine amusement, quickly suppressed beneath professional calm. "My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is my associate, Ahsoka Tano. We represent the Jedi Order, and by extension, the Galactic Republic. We're not here on behalf of whatever criminal enterprise has been hunting you through these levels. We'd simply like to understand what you are and how you came to be here." Logan dropped from the catwalk in a single controlled fall, landing in a crouch that put him 20 feet from the nearest clone trooper, close enough that every armored soldier in the depot tensed in unison. He straightened slowly, claws still extended, sizing up the 3 of them with the particular scrutiny of a man who'd spent a very long life learning to read intentions faster than words could lie about them. "Jedi," he said, turning the unfamiliar word over. "That means something to me? Should it? You truly don't know?" Ahsoka's voice carried genuine surprise. The first time she'd spoken since entering the depot. "You don't know what the Jedi are? Sweetheart, I don't know what a lot of things are around here. Don't know what this planet is. Don't know what's causing that hum I keep feeling under my skin like a live wire. Though I got a feeling you 3 might have something to do with that." He nodded toward the twin sabers on Ahsoka's belt, then toward the coiled potential he could sense, not see, but sense, in a way that unsettled him, radiating off. Obi-Wan like heat off Duracrete at midday. "Don't know why an army of guys who all got the same face are standing behind you either. Lot of questions. Ain't got a lot of patience for answering 'em to strangers holding weapons." Obi-Wan's expression shifted, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The recalibration of a man realizing the situation was stranger than the reports had suggested. "You have no knowledge of the Force, and yet the disturbance you generated registered clearly, enough to draw us here from the temple." He studied Logan for a long moment. "What are you exactly? Where do you come from?" "Name's Logan." He didn't offer more than that, not out of strategy, particularly, but because the honest answer to Obi-Wan's question was complicated, enough that he wasn't in the mood to unpack it for an audience of strangers, however politely they'd asked. "Where I come from ain't here. That's about as specific as I can get, 'cause I don't rightly understand it myself yet. We could help you understand it," Obi-Wan offered, and Logan heard the genuine sincerity underneath the diplomatic phrasing. Heard it, and distrusted it precisely because it sounded so reasonable. "The temple has resources, scholars, archives, means of investigating disturbances like the one that brought you here. If you'll come with us." "No." The word landed flat and final, and Logan watched the clone troopers' postures shift fractionally at the bluntness of the refusal, hands drifting a half-inch closer to weapons that had, until that moment, remained purely ceremonial. "You seem certain," Obi-Wan said carefully. "I've had a lot of years to learn what happens when I follow nice. Reasonable sound in people back to their nice. Reasonable sound in buildings," Logan said. "Governments. Organizations. People who wear robes and talk about help in. And got some kind of council making decisions about what to do with fellas like me. Learned it don't usually end with me walking back out the front door whenever I want to." He rolled his shoulders, claws catching the depot's flickering light. "No offense to you personally, bub. Might even be telling the truth. But I already met some folks down here who wanted something from me too. And at least they were honest about it being about money. You're a skin me to trust an institution I know nothing about. Run by people I just met, in a war I don't understand. On a planet I fell into by accident. Pass." Ahsoka opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, glancing toward Obi-Wan with the particular expression of a Padawan recognizing a moment that called for her master's judgment rather than her own impatience. Obi-Wan, for his part, simply studied Logan for a long, quiet moment, weighing, Logan suspected whether this was a fight worth having, and what it would cost the Republic's reputation if the Jedi's first interaction with an unprecedented anomaly ended in violence rather than diplomacy. Very well, Obi-Wan said finally. We won't compel you, but I'd ask you to consider. Coruscant's Undercity is not a forgiving place for someone unfamiliar with its politics, and you've already made enemies of at least one significant criminal organization. Should you reconsider, the temple's doors remain open. Logan gave a short, humorless huff that might have been a laugh in a different life. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. He was gone before the clone troopers had fully registered his movement, vanishing back into the depot's shadowed upper reaches, with the fluid economy of a predator who'd spent centuries learning exactly how to disappear, leaving Obi-Wan Kenobi standing in the flickering dark, turning over the uncomfortable realization that whatever this being was, whatever storm his presence might eventually bring to the Republic's doorstep, he wasn't going to be brought in gently. Not this time. Perhaps not ever. Word of the Jedi's failed overture reached Count Dooku within a day, filtered up through a separatist intelligence network that had long ago established quiet listening posts within Coruscant's own security apparatus, a small irony of the war that neither side much cared to advertise. The report crossed his desk aboard the Invisible Hand, currently stationed in the Outer Rim, overseeing preparations for an offensive against a Republic supply line, and Dooku read it twice before, setting the datapad down with the particular stillness of a man recalculating a great many variables at once. An anomaly, a being of unknown origin, generating a force signature the Jedi themselves couldn't categorize, capable enough in combat to dispatch professional criminal enforcers without apparent difficulty, and most intriguingly of all, one who had rebuffed the Jedi's recruitment attempt outright. A being, in other words, who had already demonstrated precisely the quality Dooku valued above nearly all others in a potential asset: independence of mind. He did not go himself. Not immediately. That would have been an extravagance the war's demands didn't permit, and besides, Dooku had learned long ago that the direct approach rarely served him as well as patience. Instead, he dispatched an intermediary, a former Jedi Knight turned separatist agent, a woman named Sancha Rovak who had left the Order decades earlier over disagreements about attachment and duty that Dooku found, privately, rather relatable. She was given resources, a modest security detail, and instructions that amounted to little more than find him and offer him a conversation. It took her 4 days. She found Logan in a converted storage bay he'd claimed as something like a base of operations, a defensible space with a single narrow entrance, positioned 2 levels above where he'd first fought Save's enforcers, close enough to the surface that he'd occasionally catch fragments of actual sunlight through gaps in the level above. He'd spent the intervening days doing what he did best in unfamiliar territory, gathering information in the crude, effective way available to him, which mostly meant listening in cantinas, watching news feeds he only half understood, and piecing together the shape of the war from the fragments people let slip when they didn't think a stranger was paying attention. He understood now, in broad strokes if not fine detail, what the Clone Wars were. Republic, separatists, an army of identical soldiers on one side, an army of droids on the other, a conflict of a scale that made even his own violent, war-torn life feel almost quaint by comparison. Sancho approached alone, her security detail held back at a respectful distance, a calculated show of good faith that Logan noted and, despite himself, respected slightly more than Obi-Wan's armed escort. "You don't have to talk to me," she said, stopping 10 meters out, hands visible and empty. "But I'd ask 5 minutes before you decide that." "You're not Jedi," Logan said. It wasn't a question. Whatever that hum in the air was, that current he still didn't fully understand. He'd started to notice it carried different textures, depending on who stood near him. Hers felt colder than the 2 Jedi he'd met. Sharper. "I was once." A faint, humorless smile. "I left. Long story, and not the one I'm here to tell. I represent Count Dooku, leader of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The side of this were the Jedi, and the Republic would very much prefer you never hear a fair account of." And you're here to give me the fair account. I'm here to make you an offer. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. The Jedi asked you to trust an institution. Vague promises of resources, of scholarship, of a council that would no doubt spend considerable time deciding what to do with you before ever telling you anything useful. Count Dooku offers something more direct. Training, real training, in understanding and mastering whatever power flows through you, taught by someone who has no interest in making you swear oaths or surrender your autonomy, resources of your own, and the freedom to fight for a cause built on self-determination, rather than a Senate more interested in preserving its own bureaucracy than winning a war. Logan studied her for a long moment, weighing the pitch against every recruiter, every well-dressed man with a smooth voice, and an agenda he'd encountered across a very long life. The words were different this time: freedom, autonomy, self-determination, each one calibrated with unsettling precision to land against exactly the resentments a man like him would carry. That was, in its own way, more concerning than anything the Jedi had offered. This woman, or whoever had briefed her, had done their homework. "Let me guess something," Logan said. "This Dooku fella, he got claws too? Or just real good talkers working for him?" Sancha's expression flickered, a small crack in the composed, diplomatic mask. "Count Dooku is one of the most formidable warriors in the galaxy, a master of the Force, on a level neither the Jedi nor I could hope to match. He does not need to send lesser envoys to make his case with strength. He sends me to make it with respect, something I understand you haven't been shown much of since arriving here." It was a good line. Logan gave her that much. And there was something underneath the sales pitch that he recognized. Some genuine current of belief in what she was offering. She wasn't lying to him. Exactly, or not entirely. That made it more dangerous, not less. He'd learned a long time ago that the most effective manipulations were the ones that came wrapped around a kernel of real truth. "Here's what I know," Logan said finally. "I know a fella tellin' me's got no strings attached is usually the fella with the most strings. I know a war's a war no matter who's fightin' it or what they're callin' themselves. And both sides usually end up a skin. The same thing of the guy holdin' the knife. Go kill that for us. And I know I ain't decided whose war this is yet, if it's anybody's business of mine at all." He held her gaze, steady, unblinking. "Tell your count I appreciate the theater. Tell him I ain't interested in being anybody's asset. Not his. Not the Jedi's. Not till I understand what I'm actually standing in the middle of." Sancha studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she'd expected this outcome, or something close to it. "Count Dooku is a patient man," she said, stepping back toward her waiting escort. "The offer remains open. Should circumstances change, and in my experience, Logan, they generally do, you'll know how to find us." She left him alone in the storage bay's flickering half-light, and Logan stood there for a long while afterward, turning the encounter over, aware, with the particular unease of a man who'd survived this long by trusting his instincts, that he'd just made an enemy of considerably more consequence than a mid-level crime boss, and that the true scale of the war he'd stumbled into was only beginning to reveal itself. The building had once been a mid-level manufacturing complex, 3 sublevels of assembly lines that had switched over to producing droid components for the Republic's war effort after the Battle of Geonosis kicked the galaxy's economy into a wartime footing. It was, on paper, a secure facility, Republic contracted, modestly guarded, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the sort of people who filed requisition reports, which was precisely why the Separatist sabotage cell had chosen it. Logan had no idea any of this was happening when the first explosion went off for levels above his current position, a percussive thud that rattled dust from the ceiling of the maintenance tunnel he'd been using as a shortcut back toward his storage bay. He froze, every instinct honed across decades of war zones snapping instantly to alert, and felt something in the air shift, that electric current he still didn't have a proper name for, spiking sharply, charged with something that felt, unmistakably, like violence about to happen at scale. He went toward it. That was, in the end, simply who he was, had always been, across every version of every fight he'd ever walked away from or didn't. Something was burning above him, and people were probably dying. And whatever else he didn't understand about this galaxy, he understood that much clearly enough to act on. What he found, climbing up through a maintenance shaft into the manufacturing facility's lower assembly floor, was chaos in its purest form. A separatist infiltration team, 6 commando droids, and 2 organic operatives, judging by the wreckage already scattered across the floor, had breached the facilities. Security to plant charges near a power core that, once detonated, would take out not just the facility itself, but a significant chunk of the surrounding block, undercity levels included, where thousands of civilians lived in the cramped, layered dark. Republic security forces had responded, but they were outmatched and pinned down behind a barricade of overturned equipment, taking fire from commando droids, whose blaster rifles chewed through improvised cover with mechanical indifference. And in the middle of it, cutting a path toward the barricaded security forces with a lightsaber blazing and unfamiliar shade of blue-white, was Ahsoka Tano. Logan took in the scene in the half-second his instincts required. Droids. Hostages, a power core rigged to blow. A kid with 2 swords fighting like she had something to prove. And made a decision that didn't require nearly as much deliberation as it probably should have. He came off the shaft's edge in a controlled fall that put him directly behind the nearest commando droid, claws opening its chassis before its threat assessment. Protocols had finished registering his presence. The droid folded, sparking, and Logan was already moving to the next one. Adamantium tearing through plating that had been engineered to withstand blaster fire but had never been designed with something like him in mind. "Didn't figure I'd be seeing you again so soon," he called out, driving a second droid backward into a support strut hard, enough to crumple its torso housing. Ahsoka spun to face him, twin sabers flashing, genuine surprise crossing her features before the demands of the fight pulled her attention back to a droid closing on her flank. "Wasn't expecting company either. Little busy right now, in case you hadn't noticed." "Noticed plenty. Where's the charges?" "Power core. 2 levels up. They've got a timer running. And I don't have anyone free to disarm it." That was, Logan reflected, in the small detached part of his mind that always stayed calculating, even in the middle of chaos. Exactly the kind of problem he was spectacularly unequipped to solve. He didn't know the first thing about separatist detonators, timers, or power core architecture, but he knew how to buy time. And buying time for someone else to do the technical work was a skill he'd honed across more wars than he cared to count. "Then somebody better get up there," he said, tearing the last of the immediate commando droids apart with brutal, economical efficiency. "And I'll make sure nothing down here stops him." It was, in its own crude way, the first genuine act of alliance he'd made since arriving in this galaxy. Not a negotiation, not a recruitment pitch weighed and measured for hidden strings. Just 2 beings recognizing a problem and dividing the labor of solving it. Ahsoka seemed to recognize the shift too, something like relief and calculation crossing her face in equal measure before she peeled off toward the stairwell leading to the power core, shouting orders to the pinned-down security troopers to hold their position. That left Logan facing the 2 organic operatives directly, hardened, separatist agents. Professional in a way the commando droid's programming couldn't quite replicate, moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd trained together for exactly this kind of close-quarters chaos. One of them, a weak way with cybernetic augmentation gleaming along one forearm, produced a vibroblade that hummed with a frequency Logan recognized instinctively as dangerous even without understanding the technology behind it. The fight that followed was the hardest he'd faced since arriving, not because either operative individually matched him, but because they fought smart, forcing him to account for the vibroblade's ability to bite through flesh, his healing factor usually shrugged off with contemptuous ease. And because every second he spent locked in combat down here was a second Ahsoka needed upstairs to matter. He took wounds he wouldn't normally have allowed, trading efficiency for speed, ending the fight faster than caution alone would have dictated because upstairs, a girl he'd known for less than a week was racing a countdown he couldn't see. The power core's timer stopped with 4 seconds remaining. Ahsoka's voice crackling triumphant over the facility's comm system. The security troopers cheer audible even down on the assembly floor, and Logan stood amid the wreckage of separatist droids, and the two unconscious operatives he'd left breathing, chest heaving, a dozen wounds already closing across skin that had, for once, actually needed the time to do it. Ahsoka found him there minutes later, lightsabers clipped back to her belt, studying him with an expression that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from professional caution into something closer to genuine regard. "That was good work," she said. "You didn't have to help." "Didn't have to," Logan agreed, retracting his claws. "Kids down there in the Undercity didn't have to be in the blast radius either. Way I figure it, don't matter whose war this is if the people who ain't fightin' it are the ones who pay for it." Ahsoka studied him for a long moment, something calculating and hopeful in equal measure behind her eyes. "You know," she said, "Master Obi-Wan's not going to believe this when I tell him." "Tell him whatever you want," Logan said, already turning to leave. "Don't mean I'm signing up for anybody's army. Just meant I wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen when I could stop it." But even as he said it, walking back toward the maintenance shaft and the Undercity's waiting dark, some quiet part of him recognized that the line he'd drawn, no factions, no allegiances, no institutions, had just gotten considerably harder to hold. The wounds from the manufacturing facility didn't close as quickly as they should have. Logan noticed it first as a nagging wrongness rather than alarm, a gash along his ribs from the weakways, vibroblade that should have sealed within minutes, still throbbing an hour later, knitting closed with a sluggishness that felt almost like wading through mud. He'd chalked it up to exhaustion at first, the accumulated toll of a body that had been healing near-fatal wounds on a near-daily basis since he'd fallen through that tear in reality. But when a second wound, a shallow blaster graze along his forearm, took nearly twice as long to close as it should have, the nagging wrongness sharpened into something closer to genuine concern. He'd felt something like this before, rarely, and never for a reason he'd fully understood. A handful of occasions across his long, violent life where the well his healing factor drew from had run thin, forcing his body to prioritize survival over speed. It had always come back. Eventually. But eventually was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and Logan had never liked relying on eventually when the alternative was understanding exactly what was happening to him. The answer, when it came, arrived from a source he hadn't expected. He'd returned to the storage bay he'd claimed as a base, working through a slow, careful self-assessment, pressing at the ribs that still ached faintly, watching the blaster graze knit, closed at a pace that would have been unremarkable for anyone else and deeply alarming for him. When a presence at the bay's entrance made him look up, claws already halfway to extended before he registered who it was. Ahsoka, alone this time, no security detail, no lightsabers ignited. "You're hurt," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Worse than you're letting on, I'm guessing." "I heal," Logan said, which had been true for longer than he could accurately remember and had, until recently, been true without qualification. "You're healing slower." Ahsoka stepped further into the bay, studying him with the particular focused attention he'd come to recognize from her. The look of someone genuinely curious, rather than merely tactical. "I felt it back at the facility when you were fighting those operatives. There's a current around you when you use whatever it is you do. It's not the Force, not exactly, but it's something, and I could feel it getting thinner the more damage you took." Logan didn't answer immediately, weighing how much of this he wanted to share with someone he'd known for less than a week, whose institution he'd already turned away twice. But there was something about the directness of her concern, unshadowed by the careful, diplomatic calculation he'd sensed in both Obi-Wan and Sancha Rovak's approaches, that made the calculus feel simpler than it should have. "Back home," he said slowly, "I don't run out. Get shot, get cut, get thrown through a building, don't matter. Comes back. Always has, long as I can remember, which is a lot longer than it ought to be." He flexed the healing forearm, watching the last of the graze seal shut with visible effort. "Here, it's different. Every time I use it, really use it, deep wounds. The kind that should have killed me, something underneath it feels a little thinner. Like I'm pulling from a well that's got a bottom to it. For the first time in longer than I can say." "The Force has a cost for those who draw on it carelessly," Ahsoka said. "Even the deepest well runs low if you draw from it without control. Maybe whatever you're doing isn't so different." She paused. Master Obi-Wan believes your healing draws on something. Force adjacent, not light, not dark, but a raw regenerative current that exists parallel to it. If that's true, it might mean it can be depleted, the way any force ability can be, if pushed past its natural limits without rest or training to manage it properly. It was not a comfortable thought. Logan had built his entire understanding of himself, his tactics, his recklessness, the particular fearless calculus that let him walk into fights other people would never survive, around a healing factor that had never once, in a life spanning well over a century, given him reason to believe it had a bottom. The idea that this galaxy's strange, humming current had found a limit his own body had never possessed was, in its own quiet way, more unsettling than any blade or blaster he'd faced since arriving. So what happens, he asked, if I keep pushing it? Keep fighting like I got nothing to lose? And it turns out I actually do now? Ahsoka didn't have an easy answer for that. And to her credit, she didn't pretend otherwise. I don't know. Nobody's ever seen anything like you before, not Master Obi-Wan. Not the Council, not the oldest texts in the temple. Archives. You might recover the way you always have, given time away from combat. Or you might find there's a version of hurt, here, that doesn't heal the way you're used to. She held his gaze, steady. That's not a reason to stop fighting, but it might be a reason to start being more careful about what you're fighting for. Logan absorbed that in silence, turning it over against everything else this galaxy had already cost him to learn. That his body had a limit here it hadn't possessed before. That the war around him wasn't going to simply let him remain neutral indefinitely, no matter how many times he told Jedi and Separatist alike that he wasn't signing up for anybody's cause. That somewhere above his head in gleaming towers and shadowed council chambers, powerful people were already recalculating what he represented and what he might be worth. Careful ain't really been my strong suit, he said finally, in this life or any other version of it. But I hear you. He met her eyes. Thanks for telling me straight, instead of dressing it up like your master or that Dooku woman did. I don't really do dressed up, Ahsoka said, something almost like a smile tugging at her expression. It's not really my style. She left him with that, and Logan sat alone in the storage bay's dim light for a long while afterward, flexing a hand that had, for the first time in a life defined by its own indestructibility, begun to feel something uncomfortably close to mortal. The trap, when it finally closed on level 1313, the same tangled undercity warren where Logan had first opened his eyes in this galaxy, and it closed with a coordination that told him immediately he'd underestimated exactly how much attention his continued refusal to pick a side had generated. Save the Deveronian had not forgiven the humiliation of his enforcers, repeated failures, and in the intervening days had done what desperate, ambitious criminals in over their heads had always done throughout history. Sought a patron with more resources than his own. That patron, it turned out, had connections reaching further up the Separatist chain than Sancho Rovak's polite diplomatic overture had suggested. Connections that led, eventually, to a Sith apprentice, whose presence on Coruscant was itself supposed to be a closely guarded secret. Logan felt the ambush coming before he saw it. That electric current in the air twisting into something sharper, colder, wrong in a way that raised the hair on his arms. Half a second before the first shot came from the shadows. He'd been moving through a market corridor when the commando droids opened fire in a coordinated volley designed to herd rather than kill, driving him away from the crowded thoroughfare and into a maintenance yard where saves remaining enforcers waited alongside something considerably more dangerous. She stepped out from behind a stack of cargo containers with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd never once doubted the outcome of a fight, a Zabrak woman, young but carrying herself with a stillness that felt ancient, a single crimson blade, igniting in her hand with a hiss that seemed to swallow the ambient noise of the yard around her. They said you were interesting, she said, voice carrying an unsettling calm. I was told to find out if that was true, or merely rumor grown large in the telling. Depends who's a skin, Logan said, claws sliding free. Already cataloging exits, cover, the position of every enforcer and droid arrayed against him. 11, all told. More than he'd faced at once since arriving. You gonna introduce yourself? or just start swinging? Names have power, she said, and came at him without further warning. She was fast, faster than anyone he'd fought in this galaxy so far. Her blade a streak of red that forced him into a defensive scramble in the fight's opening seconds. A shallow cut opening along his forearm that stung with a heat, unlike any blaster wound, cauterized and yet somehow still burning underneath the seal. The dark side, he'd learn later, left wounds that lingered differently than ordinary injuries, a lesson he absorbed in the worst possible classroom. Mid-fight, blood and understanding arriving in the same terrible instant. The enforcers and droids poured in around the edges of the duel, forcing him to fight on two fronts at once. Commando droids raking the yard with blaster fire while Save's enforcers tried to flank him, and underneath all of it, the Zobrik's blade pressing an advantage that felt, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely close to overwhelming. He was bleeding from a dozen places now. The healing factor's response sluggish in exactly the way Ahsoka had warned him it might be, each wound taking a fraction longer to close than the last. The well running visibly thinner with every passing second of sustained combat. It was the 8th or 9th wound. He'd lost precise count by then. That finally broke something loose in him. A blaster bolt caught him across the thigh. At the same moment, the Zobrik's blade opened a line across his chest, deep enough to nick bone, and something in Logan that had been carefully, deliberately restrained since his arrival in this strange, humming galaxy simply stopped restraining itself. The rage that came wasn't new. He'd lived with it his whole long, violent life. An old and familiar animal thing that surfaced when pain and fury and the immediate proximity of death stripped away every careful calculation he usually maintained. What was new was the audience, the unfamiliar sky, the strange electric current that seemed to answer his fury with an intensity he'd never felt at match before. He moved differently after that, faster, more savage, every controlled economy of motion, giving way to something closer to pure animal violence. Commando droids came apart under his claws in showers of sparking components. Enforcers who'd been closing and retreated in genuine terror as the wounded, bleeding man in front of them became something considerably harder to categorize as merely a man. Even the Zobrik apprentice, for all her training and confidence, found herself giving ground for the first time in the fight, her crimson blade meeting adamantium in a shower of sparks as Logan pressed an assault that no longer had any calculation behind it at all, just fury and survival, and the animal certainty that he would not die on this cold market floor, in this strange galaxy, at the hands of people who'd never even properly learned his name. It ended not with a killing blow, some fragment of restraint held, even at the height of the berserker rage, the same old worn code that had kept him from crossing certain lines across 100 wars. But with the Zobrik apprentice retreating through a hastily thrown smoke charge, her remaining forces scattered or unconscious around a yard that looked, in the aftermath, like a battlefield rather than a market corridor, Logan stood alone amid the wreckage, chest heaving, wounds closing with agonizing slowness, the rage draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived and leaving behind something that felt uncomfortably like exhaustion he'd rarely experienced, in a body that simply hadn't ever run this close to empty before. He didn't know, standing there in the smoke and ruin, that the Zobrik apprentice's retreat would report back to a master considerably more patient and considerably more dangerous than anyone he'd yet encountered in this galaxy, a report that would, within the week, ensure that the name Logan reached ears in the Republic's highest circles and the Confederacy's darkest ones alike. No longer a rumor from the Undercity, but a confirmed and troubling variable that both sides would now move to control, contain, or eliminate before the war's balance could tip any further than it already threatened to. The days that followed the market yard ambush passed in a haze of slow, grinding recovery. Logan holed up in the deepest, most defensible corner of the storage bay he'd claimed as home, forcing himself into stillness he'd rarely practiced in a life built around momentum, watching wounds close at a pace that reminded him, uncomfortably, of what healing had felt like before his abilities had ever existed at all. It was the longest he'd stayed in one place since arriving in this galaxy, and it gave him more time than he wanted To sit with everything the last weeks had cost him to learn. He had a limit here. That was the first truth. And the hardest one, an entire life built around the certainty of his own indestructibility, upended by a galaxy whose strange, humming current had found a bottom his body had never known existed. He had enemies now on every side that mattered. A crime lord who wouldn't stop hunting him out of wounded pride. A Sith apprentice who'd report his name to masters far more dangerous than she was. A Jedi Order that hadn't given up hope of bringing him into their fold. A separatist envoy whose patient offer still hung unanswered in the space. Behind his thoughts, he had, without ever choosing to, become exactly the kind of variable. Both sides of a galactic war would spend considerable resources trying to control. Ahsoka found him on the fourth day, alone this time as she always seemed to come, and sat with him in silence for a while before speaking. You could still say yes, she said eventually. To the temple, to training. You wouldn't have to fight our war if you didn't want to, but you'd understand what's happening to you, what you're spending every time you use what you've got. Logan considered that for a long moment, turning it over against everything he'd learned since, falling through that tear in the sky, the crime lord's greed, the Jedi's careful diplomacy, the separatists' honeyed promises of freedom that concealed their own strings, the Sith apprentice's cold, ancient hunger. Every faction in this galaxy, he'd come to understand, wanted something from him. The only question that had ever really mattered was what he wanted from himself. Maybe someday, he said finally. Not today. Not for your council, not for Dooku. Not for anybody wearing a uniform or robes and calling it a cause. When I fight next, kid, it's gonna be because I decided it mattered. Not cause somebody in a nice chamber decided for me. Ahsoka studied him, and something in her expression, respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred stubbornness, suggested. She understood exactly what that answer cost him to give, and exactly what it meant that he'd given it anyway. He left Coruscant's Undercity that night, vanishing into the endless sprawl of a galaxy at war, belonging to no faction, answering to no council, carrying forward into an uncertain future the hard one. Knowledge that even a man who couldn't die could still be made to bleed for something worth bleeding for, when, and only when, he chose it himself. Logan had come to the Star Wars galaxy a stranger with nothing but claws and instinct to guide him. He left the Undercity's shadows a legend already whispered about in cantinas and council chambers alike. Not Jedi, not Sith, not Separatist, not Republic, but something the galaxy had never quite had a name for before, and would spend a long time trying to define. Somewhere above, in gleaming spires and shadowed war rooms, both sides of a galactic conflict recalculated their plans around a variable neither could claim, neither could control, and neither could afford to ignore. The Force, as the Jedi liked to say, bound all things together. But some things, Logan had proven, only ever bound themselves to their own reasons. And in a galaxy drowning in causes demanding loyalty, that made him more dangerous and more unpredictable than anyone in the war had yet accounted for.